Let's talk a little bit about equity and inequity
Yeah,
and how the gap is widening
yeah.
in India. And how do we have programs? How do we have interventions? What do we do? What do you think that we should do? How can we all come together, collectively work together to kind of close that gap and have a more equitable uh, education system in the
Yeah,
country?
it's a big question.
Definitely.
I think let's start with what we all know.
Right.
Like we know that we have a country with 300 million plus school-going children,
Right.
right? We know what basically all of the media says, which is that
Yeah.
the demographic dividend rate basically tells
Yes.
us that we're in this moment of time in India
Right.
where we have the world's largest share of young people, right? And who those young people grow up to be
Hmm.
is largely going to basically shape the
Shape.
future of India.
Definitely.
Right? And so we know we're at this moment of time where it feels urgent,
Hmm.
it feels consequential, it feels like the moment of time that we are at
Yeah.
is going to shape the next several decades in this country.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
And yet we also know that underlying that, like the foundations of which we are building upon don't feel very strong.
Hmm.
Right? We have half of kids who aren't able to read something that is 3 grade levels behind them. We have more than 70% of kids dropping out before 10th. We have a situation that tells us if you are from the bottom 25% of India, like you have less than a 4% chance of actually graduating from college. And so we have these statistics that are staring at us, telling us actually that for the vast majority of Indian citizens, shaping that future does not feel like a possibility. And as long as we continue to stare at that, well, that is a moral crisis that does not just affect a few. It doesn't even just affect a few million. It affects all of us.
Right.
And because of the sheer size of India, it affects the entire world. And so that's what we all know. But then when you actually look into it, you say, well, why are we facing this? And what is it going to take to be able to fix this? Well,
Yeah.
we also know that much of India's history
Yeah.
and much of the last 75 years and what happened before the last 75 years can point to basically why we're in this place. But if we start to ask ourselves, so what is it going to take to be able to get us out of this, to be able to shape a better future?
Right.
Well, I think we have to start to grapple with some real tough questions,
Questions. Yeah.
right? Which is, well, how do we start to reset our expectations? You see, right now, the average Indian citizen, most of us believe that poverty dictates destiny. Most of us believe that a child from a low income background will not be able to achieve at the same levels as their peers from a high income
Definitely.
background,
Yes. Yeah.
right? And as long as you've got this large deficit of belief,
Hmm.
we're not going to get very far.
Hmm.
Because every time we look at kids that are coming from low income backgrounds, we're going to expect something fundamentally differently than we expect from others.
Right.
And that is something that we have to fundamentally shift. So, one of it is culture
Hmm.
and what we believe.
Hmm.
And the second thing that we have to grapple with is that because of that, and largely because of what's happened to education over time, well, we have a real deficit in talent. And that doesn't
Definitely.
mean that India has a deficit of talent. India has actually got some of the strongest, greatest talent.
Right.
But we do not have people jumping up and down saying, like, I want to go into teaching. I want to go into schools.
Right. Right.
And we need to figure out how to change that.
Yes.
We need to figure out how to make teaching actually one of the most aspirational things in this country. We need to figure out
Absolutely.
how to make working with an education one of the most aspirational things in this country.
Yes. I'd like to add something,
Yeah.
Sandeep. So, sorry to cut you off, but I
No,
think
please.
that over my journey in the education space has led me to believe that teaching is, one of the last
Maybe
priorities,
100% is, yeah.
for anyone to pick up because, they're looking at
Yeah.
other well-paying jobs and it's not an aspiration like you say. So, yeah, please continue. I just want
No,
to
I
add.
mean, you're spot on, right?
Right.
So, what's it going to take to be able to shift that, right?
Hmm.
And part of what's going to take to be able to shift that is we have to figure out how to shut down this argument that,
Hmm.
well, we need to make sure that the most privileged in India, the top 10 to 20%, they get everything that is innovative, they get everything that is the best, and everybody else just deserves the basics.
Hmm.
And we've been stuck in that argument for much of the past 2 decades. Just get the majority of Indians the basics. That's all that we need to be able to move forward. We need
Right.
to figure out how to basically say, actually, our most struggling, our most disadvantaged, actually need to be getting our best.
Yeah, a lot more than
And we need
they
to figure out
yeah.
how to put in everything that we can
Sure, yeah.
to be able to flip this equation around.
Hmm.
And so when you dig into that a little bit, what you start to realize is that actually, like, our schools themselves, the institutions that were designed to figure out how to be able to basically get kids to succeed, well, they're not succeeding.
Hmm.
And so when you ask yourself, well, why aren't they succeeding? Well, you start to realize that actually, well, a lot's changed in India over the past 75 years,
Right.
right? And our current education system really was designed about 75 years ago, right? And when you say, well, India's changed quite dramatically over the last 75 years, right? Our workforce has changed, our economy has changed, the world in which we live in has changed. Our schools have kind of stayed the same, right? And if our schools aren't able to basically keep up with that change, then kids don't stand a fighting chance. Right. And so we need to figure out how to basically say, what's it going to take to get schools into the 21st century? And we also have to recognize that kids actually growing up in today's India, right? A child born today, right, September of 2024, is actually quite likely to see the beginning of the 22nd century.
Right.
But we're still preparing kids for the 20th century. And so we need to basically ask ourselves some of the tough questions that we have to be holding to say, what's it going to take to get India out of the state?
Right.